Big Shaq came to the park to coach kids, not cause chaos. But one phone call turned a court full of laughter into a stage for suspicion. What started as a routine practice exposed generations of fear, and one hidden connection that changed everything. Because when the sirens faded, the truth hit harder than anyone expected. The child she was trying to protect was already being saved. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. There's something about the Light and Harmony Park during the late morning. Golden and easy, like time itself decided to take a breath. The neighborhood's wide open lawns, cracked basketball courts, and sun-dappled oaks make it feel like a place where kids can still just be kids. And right there in the center of it all is Shaquille O'Neal, or as the kids call him, Coach Shaq. Not Shaq the Hall of Famer, not Big Shaq the legend, just Coach, The town wasn't the kind that usually made headlines. It was tucked 30 miles outside the bustle of the city, with cul-de-sacs full of modest homes, weathered porches, and a grocery store where everyone knew your name, or at least your favorite chips. But over the past year, something had shifted. Ever since Coach Shaq started showing up at the park, people had started seeing things differently. Or maybe it was the kids who saw first. Maybe they always do. Shaq didn't advertise it. No flyers, no press. He just showed up one Tuesday morning with a crate of basketballs, a case of bottled water, and a whistle he never actually used. He started calling out drills. One kid showed up, then 3, then 12. And before long, every Tuesday and Thursday, the courts were full of shouting, laughter, and the unmistakable rhythm of sneakers against pavement. These weren't just drills. They were lessons about life tucked inside, bounce passes, and layups. Shaq had a way of teaching that didn't feel like teaching. He talked to the kids straight, no sugarcoating, no lectures, just stories. Stories about growing up too fast, about being judged before you even speak, about finding the right people to believe in you. And when he spoke, even the noisiest kids quieted down, because they knew he meant it. Among the kids, there was Zay, a quick-footed kid with a mouth that didn't stop and a hunger to prove something. There was Kelvin, quiet but fierce, whose mom dropped him off with a nod and picked him up like she was clinging to her last bit of peace. Trinity, the only girl who stayed for every session and beat half the boys without breaking a sweat. And Logan, the newest face, a shy freckle-faced boy with nervous energy and a cross necklace tucked under his shirt. They were different in every way, except for one. On that court, they were a team. Shaq treated them all the same, not like charity cases, not like fans, like people, like they mattered. He never asked questions he didn't need answers to, but the kids gave him everything anyway. Stories about their schools, their struggles, the names of the bullies they didn't want to say out loud. And Shaq remembered every one. The park had a pulse, and for a while everything clicked. Parents leaned against fences sipping coffee, chatting about things they hadn't discussed in years. Laughter bounced between the trees. Even the city workers who came to mow the grass started staying longer just to watch. It was peaceful, rare. But peace has a way of attracting discomfort in people who don't understand it. On a Wednesday, just as the sun was starting to rise behind the playground, a woman in a white jacket stood across the street, arms folded, sunglasses on. She didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just watched. The first time, no one noticed. The second time Shaq saw her, he raised a hand. She didn't respond. He shrugged it off. It wasn't new for him. Not really. When you're his size, his skin, his history, you get used to the staring. But there was something sharp in the way her eyes moved, something that didn't belong. She came again the next day. Then again. Always standing, never speaking. Shaq mentioned it once to Mrs. Holly, who ran the concession stand during practice. "That lady ever say anything?" he asked casually, wiping sweat off his brow. Mrs. Holly narrowed her eyes across the street. "Nope, but she gives me the creeps," she muttered. "You need me to walk over and say something?" Shaq shook his head. "Nah. People watch. That's what they do. I'm good." But he wasn't. Not really. Because he knew what was coming. The signs were always the same. The eyes. The distance. The quiet judgment. Before the explosion. He didn't know who she was. Didn't know where she came from. But he knew what she saw when she looked at him. And it wasn't a coach helping kids find confidence on a court. It was something else. Something she'd been taught to fear. Still, Shaq kept showing up. Kept coaching. kept laughing with the kids. But now he started scanning the crowd a little more. Not paranoid, just aware. That Thursday, Logan stayed late, after practice. Shaq was locking up the gear when he heard the boy's voice. "Coach, can I ask you something?" "Course," Shaq said, turning around with his signature half-smile. "Why do you do this?" Logan's voice was honest, a little sad. Shaq leaned against the fence, arms crossed, eyes kind. "Because when I was your age," he said slowly, "nobody ever showed up for me. Not like this. So now I do. That's it." Logan nodded, as if holding on to that sentence like a truth he'd never heard before. Behind them, just across the street, the woman in the white jacket turned and walked away. No words, just shadows trailing her steps. That night, the park was quiet again. But something had shifted. Shaq could feel it. In the stillness, in the air, like a storm was building just past the horizon. Not the kind with thunder and rain. The kind that changes people. Tomorrow the sun would rise on Harmony Park again. But peace is fragile, and someone had decided it didn't belong here. Shaq didn't know what would happen next. But he knew this. He wasn't going anywhere. Not now. Not ever. Kendra Whitmore had only lived in the neighborhood for 3 weeks when she first noticed the tall man on the basketball court. From her sunlit kitchen window, between slices of multigrain toast and pouring juice into her son's thermos, she watched him. His size was the first thing that caught her eye. Towering, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of purpose that unsettled her. She didn't know who he was, not really, only that he looked out of place. She'd heard murmurs in the cul-de-sac when they moved in. Something about a retired ballplayer coaching kids at the park. Some of the neighbors liked it, others kept quiet, but nobody told her his name, and she never asked. Kendra didn't believe in confrontation. She believed in boundary-controlled spaces. Predictable routines. That man on the court, he didn't fit into any of those things. At first she watched with a casual kind of detachment. She wasn't judging, or so she told herself. She just wanted to know what her son, Logan, was doing after school. It was his idea to join the park group. Said it looked fun. Said the coach was nice. Kendra allowed it, because she didn't see the harm. But now she wasn't sure. The problem, if she could articulate it, which she couldn't, not even in her own head, wasn't about what he was doing. It was about everything else. His size, his voice, the way kids gravitated to him like bees to nectar, the way even grown men on the sidelines deferred to him. It was power. It was presence. And for reasons she didn't fully understand, it made her uneasy. By the end of the second week, her discomfort curdled into something more fixed. It wasn't something the man did. There were no raised voices, no wild behavior. In fact, he was polite, respectful. He helped kids up when they fell and even picked up litter when the trash bins overflowed. But that only made her more suspicious. Nobody's that perfect. On Friday afternoon, Kendra stood across the street from the park, arms folded tight against the cool breeze, white jacket zipped to the collar. Her sunglasses masked her eyes, but not the scowl settling on her lips. She watched Shaq lead a group of kids, her son among them, in shooting drills. They were laughing. They were listening. And Logan looked happy, happier than she'd seen him in weeks. But her mind was already racing. How could she be sure this man was who he said he was? What if he was using his fame? If that's what it was, to hide something darker? She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, thumb hovering over the screen. It felt ridiculous, but fear doesn't wait for logic. She made the call. Non-emergency, she clarified to the dispatcher. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. She described the man, the park, the strange situation. She used careful words, ones that couldn't be called outright racist, but carried the same weight beneath the surface. The dispatcher asked if there was a threat. Kendra paused. "I don't know," she answered truthfully. "But it just feels odd." It was a call that couldn't be undone. As she hung up, she saw Logan score a basket and turn toward the man. Shaq for approval. He gave a proud nod. Logan beamed. Kendra's stomach twisted. But she didn't leave. She stood there, watching, waiting, arms crossed tighter now, as if holding herself together. She hadn't thought about what might come next. In her mind, maybe the police would check in, verify his identity, confirm things were safe. She didn't think about the kids, about what sirens might do to their day. She didn't think about how it might feel for Shaq. for someone who had already lived 1,000 versions of this scene before. But now, every second dragged. The air felt charged. Her phone was cold in her hand. A car drove by. She barely noticed. A dog barked from across the street. She didn't flinch. Her eyes were fixed on the court, on the tall man, on her son, who laughed at something Coach Shaq had just said. And for a moment, just a brief flicker of time, she felt something unfamiliar. Doubt. The man didn't seem dangerous. He seemed kind, gentle, encouraging. But doubt, once it cracks the surface, spreads fast. She told herself it was better to be cautious, to be safe. But her chest felt tight now, and no amount of self-assurance could make it go away. When the patrol car finally rolled up beside the park, quiet but present, her breath caught. Shaq turned slightly, noticing the vehicle. He didn't flinch. He didn't panic. He just handed the ball to one of the older kids and stepped aside. The officer spoke with him. Calm, direct. A few parents approached. Concerned murmurs began. Kids slowed their movements, unsure what was happening. Logan looked confused. He walked to the edge of the court, searching for his mother. And when he saw her standing across the street in her white jacket, his expression shifted. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He just stared. Kendra looked away. The officers didn't stay long. A few minutes. Some questions. Shaq nodded. Showed ID. Maybe a conversation she couldn't hear. And then they left. No arrests. No citations. Just a quiet rupture in the day's rhythm. A scar on a memory that should have been golden. Kendra stood there for a long time, her feet numb against the pavement. She didn't cross the street. She didn't speak to Shaq. She didn't even go to Logan. She simply turned around and walked back home. Jacket zipped tight. Eyes hidden behind tinted lenses. That night, Logan didn't say much at dinner. He picked at his food, didn't look up. When she asked how practice went, he muttered, "Fine." But there was distance in his voice, a quiet that wasn't there before. And in that quiet, Kendra felt something heavier than fear. Regret. The sound came not like a scream, but like a cut in the rhythm. A jarring interruption to a beat that had been flowing smooth. Sirens. Not loud enough to panic the whole block, but just sharp enough to draw heads, to tilt spines upright, to make people look up from conversations and phone screens. On the court, the kids were in the middle of a scrimmage, sneakers squeaking, breath hot with focus. Shaq was clapping encouragement from the sidelines, calling out plays with that booming voice that somehow managed to feel gentle. And then the patrol car. It rolled up slow, a gleam of white and blue under the mid-afternoon sun, sliding along the edge of Harmony Park's cracked pavement, like it had done this before. The laughter from the court faltered. Kids glanced sideways. One of the younger boys, Jamari, instinctively stopped dribbling, his eyes wide. Parents at the far benches stood up, shielding their gaze with raised hands, confused. Shaq's voice stopped, mid-sentence. He turned, and the silence that followed was deafening. Two officers stepped out. One adjusted his sunglasses. The other rested his hand on his belt. Not aggressively, but not casually either. Their presence wasn't loud, but it was heavy, the kind that shifts the air without speaking a word. Shaq took one step forward, hands visible, posture open, calm. Years of experience had taught him how to move in these moments. Not too fast, not too defensive, just visible, just clear. Still inside he felt it, the slow burn of humiliation threading through his chest, not because he had something to hide, but because he didn't. Because even now, with everything he had built, everything he had been, this scene could still find him. The taller officer, Officer Reeves, cleared his throat. "Sir, mind if we speak with you for a moment?" Shaq nodded once. "Sure. What's going on?" The other officer, younger, flicked a glance toward the kids. "We got a call about some activity in the park. Just doing a welfare check." Shaq raised his eyebrows slightly, but didn't challenge it. "You mean coaching basketball?" Reeves gave a tight smile. "Just need to verify a few things." Across the court the kids had gone still. Trinity's hands were folded over the ball. Zay stood frozen mid-run. Logan looked confused, his brows furrowed, glancing between the officers and Shaq, unsure if this was a joke or a test or something worse. A few parents began to murmur, shifting uneasily. One of them, Mr. Delgado, stepped forward, but Shaq caught his eye and gave a slight shake of the head. "Not now." He handed over his wallet. "Name's Shaquille O'Neal." he said calmly, the edge of irony so light it barely touched the air. You might have heard of me. The young officer hesitated, flipping open the ID. Reeves blinked, clearly recognizing the name now. But professionalism masked his reaction. They confirmed his ID, asked a few routine questions. Nothing hostile. But that wasn't the point. Shaq knew the drill. It wasn't what they said, it was why they were here. Why this was happening now. And then he saw her. Kendra Whitmore stood across the street, hands shoved into the pockets of that same white jacket. Her expression unreadable, sunglasses perched high on her nose. She wasn't walking over, she wasn't hiding either. Just standing there, watching. And Shaq knew. He knew, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. The call hadn't come from a stranger. It had come from her, from a neighbor, a mother, someone whose son he'd been helping without even knowing it. His throat tightened, not with rage, not even with sadness, but with a kind of weariness that weighed heavier than either. He turned his face away from her slowly, not giving her the satisfaction of a direct look, not giving the officers anything else to react to. The kids were still silent. One of the smaller ones, Jason, whispered something to Trinity, but she didn't reply. Zay had his arms crossed now, jaw clenched. Logan took a step forward, but then stopped, sensing the invisible wall that had suddenly grown between him and the man he'd come to admire. The officers handed the ID back. Everything checks out. Sorry for the interruption, Mr. O'Neill. Shaq nodded, slipping the wallet into his back pocket. Yeah, he said, his voice a little lower now. I bet. They turned and left. The car doors shut. The engine kicked back on. And just like that, they were gone. But the damage was done. Shaq stood still for a moment, trying to decide how to reset the day, how to bring the kids back from wherever their minds had just traveled. He looked at them, not with pity, but with understanding, because he remembered being that age. He remembered how one moment like this could brand itself into your memory like a scar you couldn't name. He clapped his hands once. All right, he said, loud enough for all of them to hear. 10-minute water break. The kids moved slowly, almost robotic. Some headed toward the benches. Others lingered. Logan, though, walked up to Shaq, eyes searching. What happened? He asked. Shaq bent slightly to meet him at eye level. His voice was soft. Sometimes people see what they want to see, Logan, even when it's not true. Logan looked back across the street. His mother had turned away now, walking back toward their house. He looked up again. Was it her? Shaq hesitated for a beat. It doesn't matter, he said gently. What matters is what you see. Logan nodded slowly, unsure what to make of the answer, but feeling the weight of it. As the break ended, and the kids slowly returned to the court, the mood had shifted. They were quieter, more alert, but they were still here. They still wanted to play. Shaq picked up a ball and tossed it to Trinity. Let's run it back, he said. No refs, no whistles, just you, the ball, and the game. And for a moment things started to move again, but not the same. Shaq could still feel the sting of it, not because of what the officers said, but because of what they had to come out for. Because of what someone assumed, despite all the evidence to the contrary. He'd been here every week, giving time, giving heart, and still, it hadn't been enough to shield him. He looked at Logan one more time. The boy gave a small, shy wave. Shaq returned it. Somewhere inside, a decision was forming, not one made out of anger, but out of resolve. Because if this was how the world saw him, then he'd keep showing up until they had no choice but to see something different. Until respect wasn't conditional. Until trust didn't come with caveats. Until peace in the park didn't depend on the color of the coach. Shaq didn't linger after practice that day. No jokes, no fist bumps, no extra drills or cool-down stretches. Just a slow, quiet walk to the bench, where he'd left his duffel. The kids scattered quickly, uncertain how to navigate the change in tone. Even the usual "see ya, coach" fell away. He offered a nod here and there, but his eyes stayed low, his movements deliberate. Shaq wasn't angry, not outwardly, but a different kind of silence clung to him, heavier than fatigue, thicker than sweat. When he walked away from Harmony Park, it felt like something had been left behind. Back at his home, tucked just outside town on a quiet road where the trees leaned in like they were always listening. Shaq sat for a long time in the kitchen, without touching the bottle of water on the table. The afternoon's events replayed like a loop. The kids' faces, the officer's careful tone, the cold realization when his eyes met Kendra's. He didn't need her to confess. He already knew, but knowing didn't soften it. If anything, it made it harder. Elsewhere in the neighborhood, Kendra Whitmore was trying to pretend it had all gone back to normal. She moved through her kitchen with a kind of performative calm, loading the dishwasher, wiping the counter, pretending the day hadn't cracked something open in her chest. But Logan was watching her closely, too closely for a 10-year-old. He hadn't said much during dinner, but his eyes followed her with quiet purpose. It was that look kids get when they've figured something out and are waiting to see if you'll tell the truth about it. After dinner, as she folded a load of laundry in the living room, Logan finally asked it, not with accusation, but curiosity that cut cleaner than blame. "Did you call the police on Coach Shaq?" Her hand stopped. The soft cotton of a t-shirt slipped from her fingers. She turned slowly, trying to calculate a way around the question. But there wasn't one. Not really. She could deflect, lie, say it was just a misunderstanding. But she knew Logan. He'd feel every part of it. "Why would you ask that?" she said, even though she already knew the answer. "I saw you watching. Before the cops came," Logan said. His voice was soft but steady. "And Coach didn't do anything wrong." Kendra swallowed. Her throat felt tight. I didn't know who he was," she began, voice faltering. "I just got nervous." "But you saw him," Logan said. "You saw him helping us. You saw him laughing. Why would you get nervous about someone like that?" She didn't have an answer. Not a good one. Not one that wouldn't crumble under the weight of its own weakness. So she sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap like she was bracing for something. "I think," she began, choosing each word like it was made of glass. "Sometimes grown-ups carry ideas they don't even realize they've picked up. Sometimes those ideas come from the people who raised us, or from things we saw when we were too young to understand." Logan was quiet, listening, processing. "When I was your age," she continued, "my dad, he was strict and scared. He always said you had to be careful, that you couldn't trust certain people, that some folks didn't belong in certain places. And I listened, even when I didn't understand why." "Like Coach Shaq?" Logan asked. Kendra's eyes dropped. "Yes," she admitted. "People like him. That's what I was taught. And maybe part of me still listens to that voice, even when I know it's wrong." For a moment, there was only the sound of the dryer humming in the next room. Logan's face was calm, but his eyes were older now. He didn't speak with contempt. He didn't yell, but his disappointment sat heavy between them. "He's the best coach I've ever had," Logan said finally. "He makes us feel like we matter." Kendra blinked, and the sharpness of that truth pierced something soft inside her. She wanted to say sorry, she meant to, but the words caught. Her mouth opened, then closed again. The apology stayed unspoken, jammed behind the old fear, the inherited instincts that hadn't been questioned until now. Later that night, long after Logan had gone to bed, Kendra sat alone in the den. She pulled an old photo album from the bottom shelf, one she hadn't touched in years. Flipping through it, she stopped on a picture from her 9th birthday. Her father stood behind her, hand on her shoulder, stern face framed by sunlight pouring through the trees. He was always a hard man, worked construction, wore long sleeves even in the heat, said little, trusted little. She remembered his warnings. Don't talk to strangers. Stay away from trouble. If you see something that doesn't look right, it probably isn't. But there were other things too, more pointed. About neighborhoods. About people. About what kind of folks caused problems. She never questioned him back then. He was her father. He was right. But tonight, looking at that old photo, she felt something else. A quiet grief. Not for what he taught her, but for how long she carried it without knowing. In that moment, something began to shift. Not a grand transformation, just a crack in the foundation. A question whispered where there used to be certainty. She couldn't fix what she'd done. Not overnight, but maybe she could start by doing something different. Listening. Watching closer. Letting go of the script she'd been handed. Down the hallway, the soft sound of Logan's breathing was steady through the cracked door of his bedroom. Kendra stood, closed the photo album, and walked slowly to the window. Outside, Harmony Park was just a silhouette in the distance. Still, quiet, waiting. She didn't know what the next day would bring. But for the first time in a long time she wanted to learn. The streetlights buzzed softly outside the Whitmore house, casting long shadows over the front steps and across the trimmed lawn. It was a quiet night, the kind where stillness hummed between the houses, and even the air seemed to be listening. Logan sat on his bed, fully dressed though it was past 9, the glow of his nightlight barely cutting the dim. He stared at the ceiling, hands clenched in his lap, heart tapping against his ribs. Down the hall, his mother's footsteps had settled. The TV murmured low in the living room, and he knew this was his chance. He slipped on his sneakers, grabbed his hoodie from the back of his chair, and eased the window open. It wasn't the first time he'd thought about sneaking out, but it was the first time he followed through. Not for fun, not for mischief, for truth. The walk to the community gym wasn't long, just 5 blocks, but every step felt heavier than the last. Logan's breath came in little puffs under the autumn night sky, nerves knotting his stomach. What if Shaq wasn't there? What if he was angry? What if this whole thing was a terrible idea? But something deeper pulled him forward. Something louder than his fear. Because what had happened in the park, the sirens, the whispers, the way Shaq's shoulders seemed just a little lower afterward, hadn't left Logan's mind since that day. He needed to say something, needed to let Shaq know the truth. Not just about what happened, but about why it mattered. When he reached the gym, the outside lights were still on. That was a good sign. The big door around back, the one the kids used during camp days, was cracked open. Logan pushed it gently and stepped inside. The gym was mostly empty. A few balls lined up along the wall, a cart of cones half filled, and at the far end, the unmistakable silhouette of Coach Shaq. He was sitting alone at the edge of the court, elbows on his knees, watching the scoreboard that hadn't lit up in weeks. A bottle of water sat untouched beside him. His presence filled the space, even in silence. Logan hesitated by the door, suddenly unsure of his voice. But Shaq turned before he could speak. "Hey there, young blood," he said, not surprised, not startled, just warm. "You sneaking out or training in secret?" Logan smiled nervously and stepped closer. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Shaq nodded, patting the bench beside him. "Always." Logan sat, knees bouncing slightly. It took him a moment to gather the words, to shake the fear that maybe he was crossing some kind of invisible line. But then he looked up, really looked at the man beside him, and the fear cracked. "I know what happened the other day," he said softly. "At the park. I know it was my mom who called." Shaq didn't flinch. His eyes stayed on the scoreboard for a breath, then slowly turned toward Logan. No surprise, no judgment, just a stillness that held the moment gently. "I heard her talking on the phone," Logan continued. "I didn't mean to, but I knew. I didn't know how to tell you." Shaq was quiet, but his silence wasn't empty. It was filled with something deeper. Not disappointment, not resentment, but a kind of quiet sadness. The kind that comes from knowing too well how the world turns. "She didn't mean to hurt anyone," Logan said quickly, defensively, even as he struggled with the truth of it. She gets scared easy. My grandpa, he was the same way. He used to say stuff about people, about those kinds of neighborhoods. I didn't really get it, but now I think, maybe she learned it from him." Shaq let out a slow breath. Not a sigh. More like he was releasing something old from his chest. "You know," he said, voice low, "when I was your age, I used to think the world was made of good people and bad people. Real simple, black and white. But then you grow up, and you start seeing the cracks. You see how fear gets passed down like family heirlooms, how people carry it in their bones, like it's part of their name." Logan listened, shoulders tight. "But here's the thing," Shaq continued. "Fear ain't truth. It just feels like it when no one questions it. And hate's just fear that never got healed." Logan looked down at his shoes, thinking. "She said she was trying to protect me." Shaq nodded. "She probably believed that. But you were helping us. You were helping me." Shaq looked at him now, his gaze full and steady. "I know, and I won't stop. Not because of her. Not because of anyone. You know why?" Logan shook his head. "Because if I quit every time somebody doubted me, I'd never have made it past middle school." Shaq said, a half smile tugging at his mouth. "What I do, coaching, showing up, it's not about changing your mom. It's about making sure you don't turn into her." That hit Logan harder than he expected. His eyes started to sting, but he blinked fast. "I don't want to be like that," he said. "I want to be like you." Shaq chuckled gently. "Nah, man, be better than me. Be louder. Be kinder. And when you hear the wrong kind of talk, the scared kind, the angry kind, don't just ignore it. Ask where it came from. Break it apart. That's how we stop passing it on." They sat in silence for a few beats, just the sound of the HVAC humming and the basketballs creaking in their racks. "I'm sorry," Logan said finally. "For what she did." Shaq put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Big, steady, forgiving. "You didn't do anything wrong. You came here. You spoke up. That takes guts most adults don't even have." Logan nodded slowly, like he was locking the moment into memory. It felt important, more than a conversation. It felt like a turning point. Shaq stood, stretched his back, and smiled. "You got school tomorrow, right?"
Yeah.
"Then get your tail back home before you get grounded for life," Shaq said with a wink. Logan laughed and stood too. "Will you be at the park this week?" "Wouldn't miss it," Shaq said. "We got drills to run, and dreams to chase." Logan ran back into the night, sneakers tapping the sidewalk, breath light, heart fuller than when he left behind him. Shaq watched until the boy disappeared down the block. Then he turned back toward the court, sat down, and let the quiet settle over him again. This, he thought, is how change begins. Not with grand speeches or headlines, but with a kid sneaking out to tell the truth, and a man who chooses not to break when he has every right to. "You should be ashamed. This is what racism looks like. Your son deserves better."
You called the cops on Shaq? Are you serious?
Kendra tried to stay offline, tried to keep her head down, but the whispers began in the grocery store, side glances during school pickups, cold shoulders at the local coffee spot. Parents she used to chat with in carpool lines now turned their backs, murmured things just loud enough to be heard. She hadn't thought it would become this. When she made the call, she truly believed she was just following her gut, acting on instinct, protecting her son. She hadn't wanted attention. She hadn't even imagined the possibility that it could snowball into national controversy. But now, sitting in her kitchen, blinds drawn, phone face down on the counter, she was living in the wake of something she couldn't control. Logan was quieter now. He didn't talk about Shaq, but he also didn't talk much at all. He came home, did his homework, and disappeared into his room. Kendra tried to reach him with soft questions, half-hearted jokes, offers of pizza nights or bike rides, but none of it landed. Something in their home had shifted, a quiet fracture that couldn't be mended with routine. She received an email from her office, politely suggesting she take some time to let things settle. Another message from the HOA politely reminded her that her presence during community events may no longer be beneficial at this time. Each note was dressed in professional politeness, but the message underneath was the same. "You did this, and we don't want you here right now." Even her mother called, not with comfort but confusion. "Kendra, I raised you better than this," she said, voice tight. "You knew who that man was. You knew better." Kendra wanted to scream. "Did I?" she wanted to ask. Because if she had known better, why had her hand still dialed those numbers? Why had her voice still wrapped fear in a polite tone and fed it to the dispatcher? The truth was, she didn't know if she'd really believed Shaq was dangerous. It wasn't about facts. It was about that slow, old reflex in her bones. The one passed down like china in family stories, telling her that certain things didn't belong. That safety meant sameness, and that anything else required control. And now she was paying for that lie. Late one night, after Logan had gone to bed, she stood in the bathroom brushing her teeth and caught her own reflection. She looked tired, washed out, older than her years. Not because of the news cycle, but because she couldn't pretend anymore. Not to her son, not to herself. She saw it now, not just the bias, but the comfort of it, the ease of assuming, the luxury of fear. She remembered her father's voice clearly. "Keep your head down. Don't trust them. They don't think like us." Back then she didn't argue. She just listened. Obedient. Safe. But what had that safety cost? Now she saw the price in her son's silence, in her own isolation, in the cold fact that the man she feared had been the only one in the community actually doing something to help the next generation. The next morning she received a letter in the mail. No return address, just her name, scrawled in neat unfamiliar handwriting. Inside, a single sentence: "Fear is taught, so is courage." No signature. No explanation. Just that. She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to feel accused or inspired.
Maybe both.
Either way, it echoed in her mind like a drumbeat. She tucked it into her wallet, folded and small. That afternoon she stood at her front window and watched as a new group of kids headed toward the park. Logan was among them, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking slower than usual, but still going. She didn't stop him, didn't call after him, just walked. Across the street, on the court, Shaq was already there. Early, as always. Water bottles lined up neatly, basketballs stacked. No security, no press, just him. Doing what he'd always done. Showing up. Kendra stepped away from the window, the weight of public scorn still heavy on her shoulders. But underneath it, something else stirred. The beginning of responsibility. The first breath of understanding. She wasn't forgiven. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time, she wasn't defending herself. She was listening, and maybe that was where redemption began. The cafeteria of Willow Heights Elementary didn't look like the kind of place where lives changed. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and plastic chairs scraped against tile as parents and faculty shuffled in, carrying tote bags, coffee cups, and the rustle of polite tension. A banner reading, "Community Conversations, Race, Inclusion, and Growth," hung unevenly above the stage, trying to soften the weight of what everyone knew this evening really was. Damage control wrapped in good intentions. Shaquille O'Neal had almost said no. When the school board chair first reached out, their email had been laced with formal apologies and hopeful language. "We would be honored if you'd consider speaking, your insight would mean a great deal." He didn't respond for 2 days, not because he didn't care, but because he did, and he'd learned the hard way how thin the line was between being listened to and being used. But Logan's quiet visits to the gym, the messages from other parents, and the knowledge that silence could sometimes be mistaken for agreement, pushed him to accept he wasn't doing it for headlines. He wasn't doing it for vindication. He was doing it because someone had to say the thing out loud that everyone else had been tiptoeing around. Kendra Whitmore hadn't planned on attending. When the email went out, she deleted it before finishing the subject line. But Logan mentioned it over dinner, said Coach Shaq might be there. He didn't ask her to go. He didn't even look at her when he said it. But the space between them at the table felt wider than usual, and something inside her knew that not showing up would only stretch it further. So she went, sitting near the back, hair pulled back tight, her white jacket folded on her lap like a relic she couldn't yet part with. The room filled slowly. Parents murmured cautiously, their eyes darting toward Shaq when he walked in. He wasn't wearing anything flashy, just a gray quarter zip and dark jeans, but he still drew the kind of attention that sucked the air from the room. He shook hands politely, nodded to a few teachers, and took his seat near the front with the calm of a man used to occupying space that made others uncomfortable. A moderator introduced him with a short bio, long enough to mention his NBA legacy, short enough to focus on his community work. When he finally stood and took the microphone, the room fell into an expectant hush. Kendra sat straighter, folding her hands tightly, bracing for impact. Shaq didn't speak like a man reading from a script. He didn't even bring notes. His voice was low, grounded, carrying the kind of gravity that made people lean in without realizing they were doing it. "I want to talk about being 10 years old," he began. "About walking home from school, with a backpack too big for my shoulders, and a head full of things I didn't understand. I want to talk about the first time someone looked at me and crossed the street. Not because I said something, not because I did anything, just because I was there." He paused, letting the silence sink its teeth in. I remember thinking, did I scare her? I was holding a spelling test in one hand and a bag of gummy worms in the other. But she looked at me like I was a threat, like I had no business walking through that neighborhood, even though it was mine. The room stayed still, no fidgeting, no coughs. Even the buzzing lights felt quieter. That moment stayed with me, Shaq continued. Not just because it hurt, but because it kept happening. Different faces, same fear. And over time you stop wondering if there's something wrong with you and start believing there must be. That kind of weight. It follows you, into classrooms, into interviews, onto courts and into meetings like this one. Kendra's fingers tightened around her folded jacket. She wasn't crying, not yet, but her eyes were wet, her chest tight with something that felt like recognition mixed with shame. Shaq didn't mention her, not once, but every word felt like it was cutting through the rows of folding chairs and landing directly at her feet. "I coach kids now," he said, "not because I need to. I've got money. I've got time. I do it because I remember what it feels like to be seen the wrong way. And I want these kids to grow up knowing what it feels like to be seen the right way, as whole, as valuable, as loved." Someone near the front sniffled. A few others shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with how close the truth was getting. But I'll tell you what's hard, Shaq added. What's hard is showing up week after week, building something good, and still being treated like a question mark. Like I need to earn safety just for being present. He looked out at the crowd now, slow and deliberate. Safety isn't a privilege, it's a right. And trust? Trust shouldn't be rationed based on the color of someone's skin or the size of their body. Kendra couldn't hold it anymore. Her eyes overflowed, and she looked down, pressing the sleeve of her jacket to her cheek, not to draw attention, not for pity, but because there was no denying anymore. He had been everything she told herself he wasn't. Safe, kind, steady, and she had chosen fear instead. Shaq closed with a quiet line. I'm not here to be a symbol. I'm here to be a person. Just like your kids. Just like mine. Applause followed. Slow at first, then building into a wave of appreciation. Not for the celebrity, but for the clarity, for the courage it takes to speak pain without venom, truth without blame. As the meeting adjourned, people trickled out, murmuring thanks, some reaching out to shake Shaq's hand. Kendra stayed in her seat for a long while, jacket still clutched in her lap. Logan, standing beside her, didn't say a word. He just placed a hand gently on her arm. I'm glad you came, he whispered, and for the first time in days, Kendra felt the smallest thing begin to mend, not with grand gestures, not with apologies yet, but with presence, with listening, with staying in the room when the truth got uncomfortable. Outside the air was cool and quiet, a different kind of silence than before, the kind that didn't hide anything. It simply waited for what would come next. The weekend began like so many others, a quiet knock at the door, followed by the familiar cadence of Kendra's mother's heels against the hardwood, the scent of gardenia perfume hugging the air, and a tight, practiced smile that said, I love you, even if it rarely sounded like it. Lorraine Whitmore was a woman of impeccable posture and precise habits, always 2 steps ahead in conversation and 3 decades behind in worldview. She hugged Logan with one arm and handed Kendra a store-bought pie with the other, the kind she liked to pass off as homemade. Kendra had barely exhaled from the tension of the school board meeting. The image of Shaq on stage, quietly dismantling everything she'd believed about herself, her safety, her instincts, her innocence, still echoed in her bones. And now with Lorraine in town, Kendra braced for polite small talk, tight smiles, and offhand comments that always skirted just close enough to discomfort to sting. But what happened that weekend shattered far more than surface-level civility. It began in the kitchen over tea. Logan had gone outside to shoot hoops against the driveway's rusted rim, his new habit since he started playing with Coach Shaq. Kendra and Lorraine sat at the table, the afternoon light slanting through the blinds in long, quiet lines. The tea was still too hot when Lorraine, without preamble, said, I suppose you've had quite the week. Kendra blinked. Mom, you saw the video? I saw everything, Lorraine replied, setting down her cup with an air of finality. People from the church forwarded it. Some of the ladies said they recognized your coat. Kendra looked away. Her coat, her silence, her shame. Everything she hadn't said was louder than the sirens now. I didn't call for attention, she murmured. I thought I was protecting your child, Lorraine finished for her, nodding once. Yes, that's what we always say. The words hung there, cold, heavy, truths polished smooth by years of repetition. Mom, do you ever wonder where that fear comes from? Kendra asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you ever ask why we think like this? Lorraine didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood, walked to her purse on the counter, and returned with an envelope, yellowed slightly with age, the edges soft. She slid it across the table like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I've wondered a lot of things, Kendra, she said, her voice shifting. And there's something I never told you. About your father. Kendra stared at the envelope. What? Lorraine's hands trembled slightly as she folded them together. Back when you were 5, your father and I had a separation. Just for a few months. We told you he was traveling for work. But we weren't speaking much then. During that time he was with someone else. A woman, a nurse at his clinic. Kendra furrowed her brow. Okay. She was black, Lorraine said, her voice flat but fragile. And she had a son. The room dropped into a stunned, soundless void. Kendra's eyes widened, her mind stumbling to keep up. Wait, are you saying I have a half-brother? Lorraine confirmed. His name is Elijah. He lives in Michigan. I've never met him. Your father and I, we made peace with it privately. We never spoke of it again. We didn't want to confuse you. Kendra's breath caught. The envelope now looked radioactive. She didn't touch it. You kept this from me? Her voice shook. All this time? You watched me grow up, judging people, fearing people, and never thought this was relevant. Lorraine's expression cracked for the first time. I was ashamed, and your father was firm. He said it was his mistake, his burden. We agreed to raise you the way we were raised. Proper, protected, clean. I thought we were doing the right thing. But all this time, Kendra whispered, all this time I was afraid of people who are my own family. Tears welled up, unexpected and sharp, not the kind that came from sadness alone, but from something deeper, betrayal twisted with clarity. Lorraine leaned forward, eyes softening. Kendra, the world we were raised in taught us to keep lines clear. Race, class, culture, everything had a box. We lived by those lines because we thought they kept us safe. But maybe they just kept us small. Kendra stood abruptly, walking to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter as her breath came harder now. The image of Shaq speaking at the school meeting, his story about walking home from school, the fear that wrapped around him like shadow came back with brutal force. And now, layered on top of that, the knowledge that she was not who she thought she was, that her blood was not just white and neat and historic, that somewhere out there was a brother, a name, a face she didn't know. But the tears came fully now. Not loud, just slow and thick, dropping onto the sink as if they belonged to someone else. Behind her, a soft knock. Logan stood at the edge of the hallway, basketball still spinning slightly in his fingers. "Mom?" he asked, confused. "What's going on?" Kendra turned, wiping her face quickly, trying to summon composure, but finding none. She knelt to meet his eyes. "I found out something today," she said quietly. "Something about our family. About who we really are." Logan tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "How do you explain legacy and shame and hidden truths to a 10-year-old? How do you unwrap decades of silence? I mean, you have more family than we thought," she said gently. "And they don't look like us. But they're still ours." Logan blinked, then nodded slowly. "Like Coach Shaq?" Kendra almost smiled through the blur of tears. "Yeah, kind of like that." He stepped closer, resting his head against her shoulder, quiet and thoughtful. No questions, just present. Lorraine watched from the table, eyes glistening now too. She opened the envelope and slid a single photograph out. A young boy with dark skin, wide eyes and a basketball tucked under his arm. Kendra looked at the photo and knew, not just that it was real, but that it mattered. Because legacy wasn't just about names in a tree or stories told over dinner. It was about what we did once we knew, how we changed, who we became. She took a deep breath, hugged her son tighter, and for the first time in her life, began to let go of the fear that had shaped her for so long. By the time the third week rolled around, Shaq couldn't leave the grocery store without someone snapping a photo. Strangers stopped him on sidewalks, not for autographs, but to say things like, "You handled that better than I ever could," or "You're a class act, man. We're behind you." His face was on more news thumbnails than he could count. The clip of the police walking onto the court had been slowed down, subtitled, dissected by every talking head with a microphone. Commentators from all sides had weighed in, some calling it a sobering example of racial bias in everyday life, others spinning it as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But what none of them captured, not fully, was what it felt like to live it. Shaq had been invited to speak on every major network. Morning shows, panel debates, even a late-night host offered him a slot for a sit-down. But he turned them all down, politely and firmly. He didn't want to be another headline, another trending hashtag. He didn't want his pain sandwiched between celebrity gossip and political soundbites. That wasn't his purpose. And if he was going to speak, it had to be on his own terms. That's why he said yes to the small podcast out of nearby Greenville. Hosted by a former school teacher named Drew Lansing, the show, ground-level real talk from real places, didn't have millions of subscribers. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest, intimate, the kind of show where people actually listened. And that's what Shaq needed, not a megaphone, a conversation. They recorded in the back room of a bookstore, surrounded by used paperbacks and the smell of old coffee grounds. Drew kept the setup minimal. 2 mics, a laptop and a promise, "We'll keep it real. No edits unless you ask." Shaq didn't need edits. He sat forward in his chair, forearms resting on his knees, voice steady. No script, no notes, just memory. I've played in front of thousands, he began. Been booed, cheered, chanted for. I felt pressure on every kind of stage you can imagine. But that day on the court, when those sirens came and the kids went quiet, that was a different kind of weight. Heavier, not because of what they said, but because of what it said about where we still are. Drew let the silence hold for a moment before asking, "Did you feel anger?" Shaq nodded slowly. "Yeah, of course. But not at the officers. They were just doing what they were called to do. My anger was deeper, older, at the idea that even when I'm showing up, I'm still seen as a risk." He talked about the kids. Trinity, Zay, Kelvin, Logan. How coaching them wasn't just about ball handling and drills. It was about helping them see themselves beyond what the world might try to tell them. Every time I run a practice, I'm trying to fix something that was broken in me when I was their age. And in a way, broken in the people around me too. The conversation turned personal. Drew asked if there had been moments growing up where he realized the rules weren't the same for him. Shaq chuckled softly. But it wasn't humor. Man, I remember getting followed in stores before I hit my growth spurt. After that, I got followed and feared. People clutching bags tighter, crossing streets. And the thing is, nobody ever said it out loud. It was always in the looks, the distance, the assumption. And you carry that. It changes how you move. Then came the moment that would be clipped, quoted, and played a million times over. "I don't want revenge," Shaq said. "I want redefinition. I want people to stop reacting to fear they inherited and start responding with questions. Who taught me to see this person as dangerous? Why do I trust my gut when my gut might be poisoned by bias? Until we get honest about that, this cycle keeps spinning." The podcast dropped that Friday. Within 12 hours, it cracked the top 10 on streaming charts. By the next day, clips were everywhere, not from major outlets, but from people. Teachers played it in classrooms. Pastors quoted it in sermons. Parents reposted it, with captions like, "This is what accountability looks like." And somewhere in the soft rustle of late evening, Kendra sat behind the wheel of her car, parked in her driveway, engine off. The podcast played through her speakers, her phone propped up beside the gear shift. Logan was asleep in the back seat, head resting against the window, a faint smile still lingering from a day at the park. She hadn't intended to listen, but something compelled her, some weight in her chest that refused to leave her alone. When Shaq's voice came through the speakers, calm and certain, she felt her throat tighten. Not because he was angry, but because he wasn't. Because he wasn't attacking or blaming. He was laying down his truth like bricks, building something instead of burning it. And when he spoke about inherited fear, about how bias gets passed like family secrets, she gripped the steering wheel tighter. She could see her father's hard eyes in her mind, hear his words. "Don't trust too easy. Stay sharp. Stay safe." She'd thought she was protecting her son, but she had been protecting her fear. And then came the moment that broke her. The redefinition line. "I want people to stop reacting to fear they inherited and start responding with questions." Kendra's tears came fast. Hot. Soundless at first, then racking sobs that made her body shake against the leather seat. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to wake Logan. But the ache was too much. Not just from shame, but from the knowledge that she'd been part of the cycle, that she'd almost passed it down. She reached back, gently brushing a lock of hair off Logan's forehead. He stirred slightly, then settled again. "I won't do it," she whispered. Not to him. Not anymore. In that parked car, alone with her guilt and a sleeping boy, she finally allowed herself to feel all of it. Not as a headline, not as a villain, but as a woman unraveling everything she thought she knew. Not far away, Shaq sat in his kitchen, scrolling through messages sent in response to the podcast. Some angry, some confused, but most were raw and real. People confessing things, reaching out, asking questions. And maybe that was the point. Not to fix everything, but to start something. To make people look, not just at the world, but at themselves. Across the court, a fold-out table had been set up beside the community cooler. On it, rows of paper cups, a stack of granola bars, and a simple sign handwritten in marker, "Hydration Station." Behind the table stood Kendra Whitmore. She wore a blue ball cap pulled low and a plain white tee, her hair tied back, her posture composed but humble. She hadn't made a grand entrance. She didn't speak much, not to the parents, not to Shaq. She'd arrived early, set up quietly, and stayed out of the way. She wasn't there to redeem herself through words. She was there to serve, to show up. Shaq saw her as soon as he walked in, but he didn't rush over. He let the space stay intact, respectful. It wasn't a reunion. It was a recognition, a choice to coexist without rehashing the past. And when their eyes finally met, she gave him a small, firm nod, not asking for anything, just offering presence. He nodded back once, subtle but certain. That was enough. Nearby, Logan darted between drills with two other boys, his voice rising above the crowd. "Let's go, Coach Shaq. I'm hitting threes today." Shaq laughed, tossing him a pass from across the court. "Only if your foot stays behind the line this time." The crowd chuckled. The rhythm returned. Harmony Park had grown. Word of the incident, months ago, and more importantly, how it had been handled, brought more families in. Some from nearby neighborhoods, some who had watched Shaq's podcast interview and decided to drive the extra 10 minutes just to be part of something that felt rooted in truth. Not sanitized, not performative. True, raw, earned. That day, more than 50 kids showed up. There were drills, of course, but also small workshops off to the side. A local college student running a table about teamwork and trust. A social worker helping younger kids with confidence-building activities. Shaq had let the program evolve. It wasn't just a basketball camp anymore. It was a community anchor. At one point during a break, Logan walked over to the hydration station, sweating and grinning. "Thanks, Mom," he said, grabbing a cup. Kendra smiled softly, brushing hair from his forehead. "You're doing great out there." "I know," he said proudly, then sprinted back onto the court before she could add anything sentimental. Shaq wandered over a few minutes later, towel slung around his neck, eyeing the table. "You organized this?" he asked. Kendra straightened, nervous but steady. "Figured I'd be more helpful with water than opinions." Shaq studied her for a moment, then picked up a cup and took a sip. "Appreciated," he said simply, then turned back to the court. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes, that was the hardest thing to give. Later that afternoon, after drills wrapped, the kids all gathered at the center of the court, forming a loose circle around Shaq. It had become a tradition, a moment of reflection before everyone packed up for the day. Shaq never gave speeches. He didn't like talking at people. Instead, he asked questions. "Tell me something you learned today," he called out. "Patience," one kid shouted. "How to pivot," said another. "Logan learned how to miss layups," someone teased, and the circle burst into laughter. Logan rolled his eyes. "I let you block me." Shaq held up his hand for quiet. All right. Now tell me what makes this place different than anywhere else." There was a pause, then a voice from the back, soft but clear. "No one here's trying to be better than anyone. We just belong." Shaq nodded, that familiar weight in his chest pressing a little tighter. "Exactly," he said. "You belong, no matter where you come from, no matter what people say about you. Here, you matter." The group broke into cheers and applause, clapping and whooping like they just won a championship. And maybe, in their own way, they had. Shaq stepped back, letting the kids bask in the moment. He looked around at the laughter, the teamwork, the adults handing out water and cheering from the sidelines, the kids high-fiving each other without a second thought to race, background or status. This park had changed, but more importantly, they had changed it. Behind him, Kendra watched with her arms crossed, her eyes soft. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Just being there quietly, consistently, was its own kind of work, its own kind of healing. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the court as families began to gather their things. Backpacks sipped, water bottles emptied, but no one rushed to leave. Conversations lingered. Plans were made for next weekend. A few parents discussed organizing a fundraiser for new equipment. A local teacher offered to tutor kids in math after practice. Ideas flowed as naturally as the game itself. Harmony Park wasn't just a park anymore. It had become a place of memory and meaning, a symbol of reckoning, yes, but also of restoration, of what could happen when people didn't run from discomfort, but sat with it, learned from it, changed because of it. As the last few kids packed up, Logan jogged to Shaq's side and nudged him with his elbow. "Next time, can we run full court?" Shaq laughed, draping an arm over the boy's shoulders. "Only if you promise not to trash talk the whole time." No promises, Logan grinned. They walked toward the parking lot together, the sounds of the court behind them fading into the warm breeze. And somewhere, tucked between the cheers, the sweat and the second chances, something else settled into the soil of that place. Something quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. Hope. If this story made you pause, good. Now imagine the parks, classrooms, and neighborhoods where this still plays out, unseen. Change doesn't come from watching, it comes from showing up. Start where you stand. Speak where it's quiet. Pass on something better than fear. The story may end here, but your part is just beginning.